The human race has constantly been fascinated by enormous and tall buildings. In history, tall giant-like structures are perceived in themselves as symbolic representation of a human civilization and advancement. In this video, we will be discussing the Tower of Babel that impressively stood out as objects of enormous heights across the narrative space of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible. This reading is extracted from Stephen Millhauser's collection of short stories, Dangerous Laughter. Before we begin, make sure you are subscribed to our channel for more readings like this. And we truly hope you would consider joining our Patreon to help us keep moving forward with our content. You should also benefit from lots of offers such as giving you a one-on-one lesson on animations and rendering. Click the link in the description to know the details. And now, let us investigate. No one could deny that the remarkable height of the tower, which was undoubtedly its most striking and brilliant achievement, was itself a cause of concern since those who lived on the plain below couldn't possibly climb to the top within the short space of a lifetime. Even those who had taken up residence in the tower could in no way be assured of success. Many were now too old for climbing, others lived too far from the top, while still others, though vigorous and within reach, had lost their early fervor and chose not to continue the arduous ascent. It was soon clear that only a small number of devout pilgrims were likely to arrive at the ultimate destination. In addition, of course, to the company of workers who had completed the final stages of the tower and were in fact the first to enter the domain of heaven. But the workers were slaves, trained by masons to lay brick upon fire-backed brick on a coating of bitumen, and otherwise uneducated, superstitious, and unreliable. It came as no surprise that their reports were unsatisfactory, especially since their words were passed down from person to person, sometimes shouted at a distance or repeated by a half-drunk servant, and thus hardly more trustworthy than the outright lie. Those living on the plain heard of brightness, a radiance, a luminous whiteness, but it wasn't clear what the first visitors actually saw, if indeed they saw anything, although one report, greeted with a mixture of eagerness and distrust, spoke of streets paved with emeralds and gold. As dwellers in the plain climbed the tower, their relation to the world below became less and less definite. After a certain point, a climber understood that he could no longer return to the plain during his lifetime. Such people, and there were many, found themselves neither on earth nor in heaven, but in some in-between realm, in which it was easy to feel deprived of the pleasures of both places. The tower had two circular paths, an inner and an outer, both of which were used by workers who, as the tower rose higher, began to work inward from the outer ramp and outward from the inner ramp, and who began to leave along the inner ramp small hollows used as storage and resting spaces. As the tower rose still higher, workers encountered another problem. The problem was solved by assigning special workers called the carriers to levels separated by 1,000-foot intervals. From each level, the carriers moved bricks to the next carrier above, who brought them to the next carrier, and so on. The carriers, who of necessity became permanent dwellers in the tower, enlarged the storage and resting spaces into primitive dwelling places, which later were elaborated into one of the tower's most striking features. For once, the carriers had begun to live in the tower, bringing with them their wives and children. The notion of permanent residence began to take hold. We have received several questions on how we animate and edit our videos. We actually use Adobe After Effects, and therefore we found several courses on Udemy on After Effects tutorials. We have also attached some of our favorite courses on architecture. The links are in fact affiliates, which means when you purchase the course, you wouldn't only increase your skills, you would also be helping us make more content. So thank you in advance and happy learning. Let's continue the video. When the tower was already so high that it disappeared into the brilliant blue sky like a long pole thrust into deep water until the end it trembles, shimmers, and vanishes entirely, the King of Shinar, renowned for his piety, ordered his workers to prepare a court high in the clouds, where he intended to spend his remaining days in fasting and prayer. When the court was ready, the 40-year-old king left his palace, and in the company of his queen, his sons, his diviners, his concubines, his courtiers, his menservants, and his musicians began the long climb up the inner ramp of the tower. By the time he arrived in his new quarters, he was an old man, his queen long dead, his son Solomon with middle age, but he took residence on the broad halls and richly appointed chambers that stretched away on both sides of the inner ramp. News of the high court spread quickly. It soon became fashionable for merchant families and even skilled laborers to arrange for living quarters within the tower, far above the roofs of the temple and the royal palace, higher than the smoke of sacrificial fires, higher. In this manner, the city on the plain was gradually drawn inside the great tower. The disappearance, as it was later called, came about in part because of the example of the pious king, but in part too because it was terribly oppressive for people to live at the foot of an enormous heaven-seeking tower, which threw its shadow farther than a man could travel in a month, and which, even at a distance, loomed like a raised arm about to strike a blow. Although it was growing higher day by day, it was always the same size to those within it, and even to those few who had remained in the surrounding countryside. For the work at the top took place in invisible regions far beyond the range of earthbound sight. At the same time, even among people who believed firmly that the tower would one day reach heaven, the early expectation of a rapid and almost miraculous success had long been abandoned. It was therefore natural enough to feel that the rise toward heaven was, in a sense, part of the unchanging essence of the tower, that the act of completion belonged to a different tower, a dream tower, a tower out of childhood stories, and was, in any case, an event so far in the future that it no longer had direct force in the lives of any but a handful of fanatical believers. There thus arose in the hearts of the tower dwellers a nostalgia for the plain, for the shouts of marketplace, the sunlight falling past the awnings onto heaps of apricots and figs, the sun and shade of the courtyards, the whitewashed temples, the outlying gardens shaded by date palms. And it came to pass that after a time many of the tower dwellers began to descend and take up their old lives in the shadow of the tower, rebuilding their ruined homes, planting their gardens outside of the city walls, and gathering daily around the stalls in the market. After the completion of the tower, there was movement in two directions. On the inner ramp that coiled about the heart of the structure, an upward movement of those who longed to reach the top, and a downward movement of those who, after reaching the top, longed to descend toward the plain below. In general, the two ways of life opposed each other in equal measure within the great tower, as if the two lines of force were part of the system of architectural stress crucial to the cohesion of the building. It was a swirl of downward nostalgia and upward longing. In the midst of such discussions, it was perhaps not surprising that the tower itself should be called into question. Troubling whispers began to be heard. Was it possible that the Great Tower didn't actually exist? We will leave this question to discuss in another video. We hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure to subscribe and like this video for part 2, and make sure to comment down below your thoughts on the existence and the entire idea of the Tower of Babel. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.